Okay, so Hitler is at Landsberg. Now, I should point out, he was not sentenced to prison. He was sentenced to what was known as fortress confinement. Fortress confinement at Landsberg Prison. He has a pretty good life there. He can pretty much do anything he could do on the outside, except he cannot leave. He has to stay there. But he can have as many visitors as he wants. In fact, some days he would spend up to 6 hours on appointments with people. Every new prisoner that arrived, just as a courtesy, was expected to go to Hitler and pay his respects. Hitler was kind of top dog. Many of the prison guards were admirers of Hitler. During the meals, communal meals with other prisoners, he would kind of hold court. The other prisoners would come to him, and he'd go on and on about stuff he wanted to talk about. Friends and admirers from all over Germany would send him wines, cheese, other food. He ate very well while he was at Landsberg here. In fact, Pucci Hopstegel, he said if you didn't know any better, you would have thought Hitler's rooms were a delicatessen, because they were always stocked with all this food. Hitler's cell wasn't even really a cell. It was more like a small apartment. For exercise, Hitler could walk around the courtyard whenever he wanted to. Very often, other prisoners would have wrestling matches or other contests, and Hitler would frequently referee. He himself would not participate in the matches. He would say, I'm a leader of a great movement. It would be undignified. The reality was he couldn't stand losing. It just would have been too much of a blow of his ego, all right? But this was a pretty nice way to live for somebody that was convicted of trying to overthrow the state. Pretty nice way to live. Now, the thing about Hitler that we know is he's not dumb, and he's got a very active mind. He's lazy, but he gets these bursts of energy, and he gets stuff done. And while he's here, he needs to do something to keep him occupied. So he begins to consider writing a book. He enlists the help of his followers and fellow inmates, and one of them here is Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was part of the beer hall putsch, so he's in there too. He had a cell across the hall from Hitler, and he acted as Hess's private secretary. Hitler dictated the book, and Hess would write it down and type it up. So Hitler is kind of just talking. He's not really writing. If any of you are writers, and hopefully I'm trying to create a little part of you that will be, it's been said anybody can write, but only a writer can edit. You need to know how to edit your work. Hitler's not doing that. Hitler's just going off, talking, and Hess is writing it down. Hess and some other people are just writing it down for him. The book repeats many of the lies and conspiracy theories, like the stab in the back theory that Hitler has espoused. The book is anti-communist, it's anti-capitalist, and it is virulently anti-Semitic. The book contains no real policy outlines, nothing concrete here, but it nevertheless does reflect Hitler's kind of Weltanschauung, worldview. Hitler's worldview and his kind of his political, I'm tempted to say principles, but Hitler doesn't really have principles, but his political direction, his political guidelines here. Ian Kershaw, whom I mentioned before, he's like one of the great Hitler biographers. He noted that this book helps to create something called the Führer myth. This idea that Hitler and Hitler alone can lead Germany back to greatness. So this book helps to create that myth, the Führer myth, that Hitler and Hitler alone can lead Germany back to greatness. Hitler writes in the book that pretty much all of history boils down to a struggle. Now, The communists, Karl Marx would say, history boils down to a struggle, but he would say it's a struggle of class interests. Right? That's what Karl Marx would say. Hitler says history boils down to a struggle of superior and inferior races. Superior and inferior races is the... So it's not about class, it's about race. So, and of course, the superior race in Hitler's worldview are the Germans, are the Aryans. And the inferior race are the Jews. There are other inferior races, but the Jews are absolutely the worst. He sees Jews as history's arch-villains. History's arch-villains. He compares them to vermin that carry disease, that poison racially superior peoples through racial intermixing. They suck these superior races dry like parasites until they're dead. He wrote that, quote, "The racial question gives the key not only to world history, but to all human culture." He says, Western democratic capitalism is a tool of the Jews. Western democratic capitalism is a tool of the Jews. But the culmination, the most effective tool of the Jews against superior peoples is Bolshevism, Marxism. That's the most powerful tool that the Jews use. Therefore, it is Germany's mission to destroy communism in Russia. At the same time, fortuitously, since the German race needs to grow, the defeat of Russia would mean more living space for Germans. And the word living space is Lebensraum. Lebensraum. So you can destroy the communists in Russia and then essentially take over their land for this concept of Lebensraum. Now, the term Lebensraum initially had been coined by a German academic named Karl Haushofer. Karl Haushofer. Haushofer had actually been a professor to Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess had been one of Haushofer's students here. So Hess was very much intrigued by this idea of land, this idea of blood and soil. Hitler argued the German population is growing so rapidly, it needs to acquire more geographic area to build cities. Now remember, European colonialism was all about exporting excess population to colonies. Germany lost all of its colonies. So it can spread eastward. Control of an entire continent is what made the United States so powerful. So in Hitler's mind, he kind of sees that as one analogy. If Germany dominated Europe up to the Ural Mountains in Russia, it would be completely self-sustaining. Remember, one of Germany's problems in World War I was it wasn't self-sustaining. You have 750,000 Germans starve because there's not enough food. But if you dominate a continent, you're going to be self-sustaining. So that's what he believes there. This is reinforced by that German experience in Oberost, in Poland, and in the Baltic countries, trying to create a scientific German government in the East. Well, let's do that, but writ large throughout Russia, right? So Hitler agrees with thinkers like Haushofer, and he marries his anti-Semitism with his desire for German autarky. What does autarky mean? Has anybody heard that word? Autarky means economic self-sufficiency. So his anti-Semitism, his desire for autarky are merged then as he looks eastward. We get rid of Jewish Bolshevism and we get land for German expansion. So from early on, Hitler's anti-Semitism is tied to his foreign policy. Okay? So Hitler's anti-Semitism is tied to his foreign policy. He wrote, quote, "The right to possess soil can become a duty if without extension of its soil, a great nation seems doomed to destruction. Germany will either be a world power or there will be no Germany. And for world power, she needs that magnitude which will give her the position she needs in the present period and life to her citizens. And so we National Socialists consciously draw a line beneath the foreign policy tendency of our pre-war world. We take up where we broke off 600 years ago. We stop the endless German movement to the south and west and turn our gaze toward the land in the east. At long last, we break off of colonial and commercial policy of pre-war and shift to the policy of the future. He goes on. If we speak of soil in Europe today, we can primarily have in mind only Russia and her vassal border states. For centuries, Russia drew nourishment from the Germanic nucleus of its upper leading strata. Today, it can be regarded as almost totally exterminated and extinguished. It has been replaced by the Jew. He himself has no element of organization, but a ferment of decomposition. The giant empire in the East is ripe for collapse, and the end of Jewish rule will also be the end of Russia as a state. So he's saying the reason why Russia had been great in the past is they had a Germanic leadership class. As I mentioned earlier, they spoke French, right? But now he's saying that's all gone. The Bolsheviks have taken over. They're running things. So Hitler writes this book, and he wants to title this book 4.5 Years of Struggle Against Lies, Stupidity, and Cowardice. His inmate and editor, one of his editors, Max Ammon, actually suggests the title that he says it would never sell, it's too long, people won't read it, and they change it simply to Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book will eventually be published in 2 parts in 1925 and in 1926. While Hitler was in prison, he puts this guy in charge of the party, Alfred Rosenberg. Alfred Rosenberg was what they call a Baltic German. I think he was born in Lithuania or Latvia, I can't remember, to German parents. He's from a German family. He kind of took a lot of flack because his last name, Rosenberg, sounds Jewish. So he'd take a lot of flack for that. But he's a very weird dude, and we'll be talking more about him later. But really, the reason why Hitler chooses Rosenberg to lead the party while he is in prison is because Rosenberg, whatever virtues, few virtues he had, he was not charismatic. And he was not necessarily a very good leader. He may have been a competent organizer on some level, but he's not charismatic. And the reason is because, one of these characteristics of Hitler that you absolutely have to understand, and we'll get into this more later, is Hitler does not like competition. And Hitler was terrified someone would be in the party who would prove to be more dynamic than him. And so by putting this kind of non-entity in charge of the party, Hitler is making himself invaluable. In that clip I showed you, there's that line where he said he wanted to resign from the party. I don't know exactly how accurate that was, but certainly Hitler would make gestures like that. You know, maybe I'll leave the party or whatever. And then people would say, well, no, we need you. There's no party without you, you know? And it's because you had, like I say, frankly, these non-entities like Rosenberg who were left in charge here. Now, because of, as I mentioned, we start to see the golden age of the Republic. We start to see the country doing better economically, and so more people are moving to the center parties, are moving away from the extreme parties. So this is a period, while Hitler's in prison and after he's in prison, where the NSDAP is losing strength. It's losing power, okay? The NSDAP is clearly on kind of a downward trajectory. Many of the factions within the party, and we'll talk more about those shortly, but many of the different factions in the party, they would fight and they would bicker and they would say, well, we need to go to Hitler for a decision. So they'd visit Hitler in jail, and Hitler would say things like, well, you need to work it out yourself. And this is, again, another typical thing Hitler would do, is he kind of would let those beneath him compete, and then it would just work itself out. And that way, Hitler doesn't have to get involved because that's work, and Hitler doesn't like work. But it's also a way of kind of keeping himself above the fray and making him indispensable. So that was kind of a typical Hitler faction. But the point is, there's a lot of infighting at this time. There's a lot of problems, and Hitler, his chief goal while he's in prison is to make sure everybody knows they need him, right? That he is in charge.